Hello, this is Chobe, the Shiny Colors Discord, and welcome to another episode of the Shiny Review. Today we've got 6 cards we need to look at from 2 separate banners as well as 2 separate events. So let's go ahead and get things started as we talk about the last 2 SSRs needed for Nocchill. Starting things off, we have Koito, the 3rd SSR for Nocchill. Koito doesn't necessarily bring anything new to the table other than the Nocchill standard Link Appeal traits. She's a strong buffer-style character that can act as a backup center if you lack the other SSR we'll talk about today. She errs on the side of defense as her main buffs last until you're attacked, much like Toru. As such, building towards attention down will be helpful if you don't trust the uptime of reaction buffs. If you're planning on building Nocchill, she's an essential unit for the time being. If you want her to be a true vocal unit, you'll need to get her to 4 stars, making her a potentially expensive permanent unit to pull for. Her stat uncap ends up being plus 250 to vocal and 100 for visual, so she ideally wants to be a vocal unit once all things are said and done. If you're willing to max out Koito, you'll have a solid piece for your eventual Nocchill setup. Her roles are center, maybe, as well as a buffer, and I would say to not necessarily try to pull for her unless you are very much dedicated to the idea of building Nocchill, otherwise you'll probably pull her eventually. Koito's initial appeal is a visual 3.0 that attacks last in the queue, and applies a 50% visual buff until you're damaged. This then links into a visual 1.5 that only requires Hinana. At max, she gets access to a vocal 4.5 appeal that attacks last, applies a 70% vocal buff until you are damaged, and links into a vocal 2.0 that requires Toru and Madoka to link. Her 1-star passive is a vocal visual 25% up that requires the turn count to be 5 or less, and has a 20% chance to activate twice. Her 2-star passive is a vocal visual 45% up that requires your turn count to be 4 or later, has a 20% chance to activate twice. Her 3-star uncap is a vocal visual plus 100, and her 4-star uncap is a vocal plus 150. Her memory appeal when maxed out is a vocal 100% buff until you are damaged, which links into a vocal 2.5 appeal on all judges. For support recommendations, finding a balance of stats will work out okay for Koito, but you might want to particularly find Attention Down to synergize with your buff. Cards like Limited Kogane stand out immediately for this reason. For alternatives, the rest of these cards should look familiar thanks to the previous Nocchill reviews. Any form of Attention Down or enmity-related passives can play well to the strengths of Nocchill, so splash them in as you can. Overall, Koito as a center gets a B, and don't worry, we'll be talking about the team build later. Koito is a tricky center to grade. On one hand, a 100% vocal buff that links into a 2.5 is fairly fine on its own. The fact that the buff can theoretically stay forever is also nice, but the odds of being hit are usually not in your favor. There are other units with similar appeals that have definite timers and don't see much play, so I don't envision this card seeing much either at the top. A solid memory appeal to climb the ladder. As a unit, she also gets a B. Koito's okay. Her buffing potential isn't anything necessarily crazy, as she herself doesn't have the means to keep her buff massively active. Her best suited team at the moment, Vocal Nocchill, will need her to be 4 stars in order to reach maximum effectiveness, so consider this if you plan on pulling. Next we have the other card of Koito's banner, Kaho. Kaho's latest SSR support is very straightforward, a heavy emphasis on building up as much dance as possible. A potential 42 dance per week, ignoring room bonuses and perfects, is very solid. The only real downside to this Kaho is the lack of synergy with the more recent Hokago supports, so it makes deciding which room to take a little bit harder. Her support skills are Idol's Bond, Promise Recovery, and Rest Boost, and her unique masteries are Dance Mastery Dance at plus 14 at level 75, and Unit Mastery Dance which reaches plus 6 at level 70. She does have a scaling support starting at a Dance 2.5, by level 60 it becomes a Dance 2.6, and at level 80 it maxes out at a Dance 3.0. Her TFD idea is Dance, and her Insight token for Grad is Vocal. Kaho's 1-star passive is a Dance 30% up that requires you to be in the dance position. This has a 20% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a Dance 60% up and Attention 30% up, and all it needs is Kaho to be on your team. This has a 20% chance to activate once. Her 3-star uncap is a Dance plus 100, and her 4-star appeal is a Dance 2.0 that follows up with a Dance 0.5 to 2.5, which scales up the higher your attention is, which means you will have a Dance 4.5 appeal if your attention is 300% or higher. Her event passive is a Dance 30% up that requires you to be in the dance position and has a 10% chance to activate twice. Kaho gets an A. New Kaho becomes a staple for dance-focused Hokago. Pairing her up with Sakura Mochi Master Chiyoko and Sleepover Baby Juri leads to incredibly high value for one room, though it does end up being a particularly picky setup. She doesn't quite synergize with the latest Dance Rinzai as well as the previous two, but it can work. She has strong passives, good support appeal, and one of the strongest 4-star appeals from a permanent SSR yet. I would recommend pulling for her if you are building Dance or Rainbow Hokago, and maybe consider it if you aren't, if you are thinking of splashing in Kaho to one of your 3-piece teams. Next we have the second banner, starring Hinana, the last of the first Nocchill SSR set. Hinana takes what Madoka set up and runs with it, taking up a more evasive role for the team. While the buff only lasts for one turn, in Hinana's case, the perceived odds of it working in your favor are high, especially if confirmation bias is in Nocchill's favor. Hinana appealing after either Madoka appeal theoretically results in one guaranteed invincible turn, which is really cool to think about. Hinana also has the most impactful of the memory appeals across Nocchill so far, meaning that if you do find her, she will most likely end up being your center unit. If you're able to play well with the dodge chances of Madoka, or pair her off with enough attention down style supports, this Hinana is a genuine threat in the lower halves of Gradefest. Once Nocchill gets access to Grad, there could be a real push for Nocchill in the higher grades. Her roles are center and dodge tank, and I would say not to necessarily hunt for her again unless you are very specifically building for Nocchill, otherwise you'll probably pull her eventually. Hinana's initial skill is a Dance 3.0 that attacks first on the turn and applies a 60% dodge chance for one turn. This links into a Dance 1.5 that requires only Toru. At max, she unlocks a Vocal 4.5 appeal that always goes first, and applies the same 60% dodge chance for one turn. This links into a Vocal 2.0, which requires Madoka and Koito. Her 1-star passive is a Vocal Dance 25% up that requires the turn count to be 5 or less. This has a 20% chance to activate twice. Her 2-star passive is a Vocal Visual 45% up that requires the turn count to be 4 or later. This has a 20% chance to activate twice. Her 3-star uncap is a Vocal Dance plus 100, and her 4-star uncap is also a Vocal plus 150. Her memory appeal when maxed out is a Vocal Dance Visual 60% until you are damaged, which links into a Vocal Dance Visual 1.2 appeal that attacks all judges. For support recommendations, if you feel this all looks familiar, you'd be correct. Hinana will want to focus on many of the same aspects that Koito does in regards to supports, but you're also welcome to splash dance units in as you feel appropriate. The alternatives stay the same here as well. Focus on attention down first, and forms of enmity or defense second. Keep in mind that Hinana is a dance unit first and vocal second, so only commit to vocal if you have her maxed out. For team recommendations, this team variation focuses on Hinana as the center, due to her having the strongest memory appeal across the Nocchill cast. Link appeals will be frequent, and thanks to Hinana, you can choose to run either pure vocal or mix these stats as you see fit. Because you have to pick a 5th member, you have to consider whether or not you might want a buffer unit like Rinze or Choco, but I think one of the more interesting choices could be this Yuika. The rationale on SR2 Yuika is due to her 4-star appeal, which is a vocal appeal that reduces your mental by 50% after use. Nocchill want to have lower attention, but also need some form of damage to get going. So because of this, Yuika actually helps bypass the rule of damage in regards to the reaction/dodge buff, because that damage actually has to be based off of whether or not a judge or a rival hits you with damage. So this includes melancholy debuffs as well, but this does not take into account abilities that reduce your mental personally, which means that Yuika's appeal that reduces your mental doesn't accidentally break Koito and Toru's buffs. You'll be able to push yourself below half and make the most of the Antika passives, which not only increase your stats, but also decrease the odds of you getting hit, but also doesn't accidentally waste your buffs from Koito or Toru. At this point, unless this Yuika strategy proves false and or pointless, you can otherwise choose a standard buffing unit, as we mentioned before, or defensive unit to act as Nocchill filler. Overall as a center, Hinana gets an A to an A+. In a sense, Hinana is the most useful center for Nocchill currently. Having access to a 60% buff to all stats indefinitely as long as your luck is high or build is strong is a hell of a power play, and might show promise once Nocchill can branch out a bit in terms of their build. This helps with flexibility, but ultimately works best for the team if you focus on vocal. As a unit, she gets about a B. Almost all the Nocchill units are built the same in terms of passives and uncaps, just with small variants in their appeals. Much like with Koito, Hinana needs to be 4 stars to make the most of her vocal potential, as every Nocchill member currently has natural access to vocal. She surprisingly plays well with Madoka cards, and is ideal if you want to keep a card like Toru strong. Next we have the SR Mei. Mei rounds out the last of the gacha units this go around, and as she is, she's okay. She plays well with the New Year's Fuyuko support, as Straylight lacks in the vocal department, but vocal is also not Straylight's main strength when it comes to team building. Perhaps this Mei will see more play once Straylight sees more units to branch off of visual Straylight. Her support skills are Idol's Bond, Promise Recovery, Rest Boost, and Stamina Support, and her unique mastery is Vocal Mastery Vocal, which reaches +9 at level 60. Her TFD idea is Dance, and her insight token for Grad is Mental. Mei's 1-star passive is a vocal 15% up that requires you to be in the vocal position. This has a 30% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a vocal 30% up that requires an active vocal buff. This has a 30% chance to activate one time. Her 3-star uncap is a +50 to vocal, and her 4-star appeal is a vocal 2.5 that applies 2 separate buffs. The first is a vocal 7% buff for 5 turns, and the second is a vocal 3% buff for 10 turns. Her event passive is a vocal 5% up if Mei is on your team, and it has a 30% chance to activate twice. Mei gets a B-. This card is overall fine. Mei has a relatively easy to use gold passive, along with a fine enough 4-star appeal, though many older SRs have something similarly strong for mostly the same functionality. She might find a place on vocal teams for now, but Straylight isn't quite leaning towards vocal currently, and support SRs have been made less valuable due to grad mechanics. Should you pull for this Mei? I'd say it's debatable. If you want an extra vocal support, she's definitely highly appreciated in the same way that a lot of people appreciate the Dance SR Asahi, but if you aren't really hurting for it, she'll come around eventually. Next we have our event card, Juri. Revolutionary Girl Juri. This Juri plays to the normal strengths and weaknesses of Hokago units of the past, with appeals that lower your defense and increase your attention while having higher than normal base damage. Just from her initial appeal, you have access to a Vocal 5.0 on an SR unit, which is nothing to sneeze at. This is then bumped up to a Visual 6.0 once the card is maxed out. The closest form of competition this Juri has to any other Juri card would be SSR 2 Juri, the Christmas limited unit. The competition isn't even really that close, though it is worth mentioning that this Juri has almost as good of a memory appeal. If you don't plan on pulling for Christmas Juri upon her presumed rerun later this year, new SR Juri should suffice as a vocal center. You'll just need to dig for a second appeal and do what you can without innate AoE access. Her roles are Center, Attention Up, and Debuffer, and I would recommend farming for this Juri if you need a vocal card for Hokago. Juri's initial skill is a Vocal 2.5 that applies 2 buffs. The first is an Attention 20% up for 2 turns, and the second is Defense 20% down for 2 turns. Her link appeal is a Vocal 2.5. At max, she gets a Visual 3.5 appeal that raises your attention by 30% for 2 turns and lowers your defense by 30% for 2 turns, and links into a Visual 2.5. Her 1-star passive is a Vocal 12% buff as long as your mental is 75% or higher. This has a 40% chance to activate once. Her 2-star gold passive is a Visual 24% up that requires the turn count to be 4 or later. This has a 40% chance to activate once. Her 3-star uncap is a +50 to visual, and her memory appeal when maxed out is a Vocal 1.0 that links into a Vocal 3.0. For support recommendations, going in on either vocal or visual is the best bet, so take your strongest passives and go to town. If you plan on having her be a center, focusing in on vocal is the potentially better deal, so mix and match as you see fit. For alternatives, pick your favorite flavor of Natsuha and consider SR variations of any SSRs you may not have to work with. You can also opt for the SSR Vocal Rinzai if you plan on building in Wing rather than TFD or Grad. I don't necessarily recommend it if you are planning on climbing the ladder, but it is an option. For team recommendations, Vocal Hokago really hasn't changed since New Year's 2019, so you can just substitute out Limited Juri in favor of this Juri, if that's your interest. It's not as strong in the long run, but it's a reasonable option. As for alternatives, depending on what type of buffers you have or do not have, you can include the SR Chiyoko or SR Rinzai, SSR 3 Rinzai, or the more recent SR Natsuha. Juri as a center gets a B-. She's solid enough for a freebie unit, but not a real heavy hitter. You might also find it harder to push up the damage of this unit, as her innate uncap is not for vocal, forcing you to grab more stat uncaps from supports. That said, with the right stats behind her, it's fairly competent. As a unit, she also gets a B-. Juri doesn't really do anything particularly special among Hokago cards and has nothing that is particularly striking with her numbers. Her passives are strictly okay, and her appeals are par for the course for Hokago, though that does mean that they are relatively strong compared to most other SRs. If the attention gain was higher, you might see her splash onto some attention-focused Hokago setups, but for now, she's strictly a filler unit till you find a stronger Juri. Plus, it also means that if you true render, that's a free 3,000 gems just for playing in one event, which is always appreciated, so consider that as well. And lastly, we have our event rerun card of Mei. Gee Mei, how come your producer lets you have 2 cards in one video? The initial Stray Light support from last year, Mei set the standard for what would become the calling card of Stray Light supports, a focus on setting active buffs and running with it. She's more or less outdated now, but filling out the collection should be fine. Her support skills are Idol's Bond, Promise Recovery, Rest Boost, and Stamina support, and her unique mastery is Vocal Mastery Vocal, which reaches +8 at level 75. Her TFD idea is Vocal, and her insight token for Grad is Mental. Mei's 1-star passive is a Vocal 18% up as long as you have an active Vocal buff. This has a 30% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a Vocal 35% up that requires an active Dance buff. This has a 30% chance to activate once. Her 3-star Uncap is a +50 to Vocal, and her 4-star Appeal is a Vocal 2.5 that applies a Vocal Dance 10% buff for 5 turns. Her event passive is a Vocal 6% up that requires Mei on your team and has a 40% chance to activate twice. Mei gets a B. This card has aged somewhat okay, mostly because her buffs end up being okay enough for teams if you're just looking for them. You have to have the means to activate the buffs, but fortunately she can provide for that. She's an interesting subunit for teams that already play around with active buffs if you are looking for a final member. Should you farm for her? Well, you might as well. And that's going to do it for the video today. Thank you so much for making it through this longer video than normal. Next time we'll be looking at whatever banner comes next. We have a feeling of what it might be, as we know that we're getting a scenario event with a support SSR Madoka, so it could be time already for a limited Nocchill card, but we'll just have to see. Once again, thank you for watching, my name is Cho, and have a wonderful rest of your day.